fired up for today's episode. John Middlekauff, former scout for the Philadelphia Eagles and the host of the Three and Out podcast on the Volume Sports Network, has joined me today for a really special episode. John's Twitter handle is at John Middlekauff, Middlekauff. John, let the audience know where they can find your content.
Yeah, I mean, just YouTube, podcast, Apple, Spotify, anywhere you listen. So pretty easy to find. Just type in my name or Three and Out, and it's all up there.
Awesome. So John's journey actually began at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Actually a Cal State alum myself. He majored in business, graduated in 2008, but before graduating, he actually had a business development internship with the Chiefs. John, during that summer in 2007, were you exposed to the football operations at all, or were you mainly on the corporate side there?
Where'd you go to school?
Cal State Northridge.
Okay, yeah, we're just both Cal State alums. Yeah, it was just, early on in college, like a lot of people trying to figure out what you're going to do. And, it's like most people, you take a business path, try to get involved with a bank or finance or anything you don't really know. And I realized probably by my second year that I really wanted to work in sports. Now, I didn't necessarily know how, what, where. It's not like my dad was a coach or an executive or anything. So you just kind of figured it out. And I started working for the athletic department. And then probably by going into my fourth year, I was a 5-year guy. I don't know about you. And 4.5, I started just mailing letters to teams and colleges. But back then in, 2007 range, colleges didn't really have a personnel department. It's nowhere near like it is now, 20 years, not even, but 15 years, 20 years later. So the Chiefs were the only team that wrote me back. I actually got a lot of letters saying no. And the Chiefs had like unpaid sales internship. So I was like, shit, I get credit for it, through school. And I basically took the quarter off. And my dad, through a family friend, knew a guy that lived back there. So I essentially rented a room, I think, for a couple $100 and did like more corporate sales. But when I did that, I had kind of made my way up to try to introduce myself to some people on the football staff, like their director of, I don't even know what, football administration I get. He was kind of Herm Edwards, who was the coach then's right-hand guy. And it really got my juices flowing, that I wanted to work in football, being in that building. And the Chiefs were, this is way before Andy and Patrick Mahomes. They were terrible. They were really bad. And when I got back to college, I really got involved with the football program at Cal Poly, which was easy to do because it was a small operation, and helped them out with recruiting, did some stuff at practice, and it really got the ball rolling there for my aspirations to work, in football. When I was at Cal Poly, I also wrote I don't even know if school newspaper still exists, but I had a little column called Johnny in the Box for the school newspaper, where I was kind of like a Bill Simmons knockoff. Once or twice a week, I wrote, probably like 800-word column on the back of the paper. It was cool. I had my picture, on my column. So I was always dabbling in the whatever I'm doing now, you would call it, but the football bug and kind of getting involved. I played in high school, and there was something special. I was terrible, but the teammates, the group, it was a game that I loved my entire life. And kind of got me rolling. I didn't do much when I was at Kansas City with the football side beside, pick their brain and stuff. It was mainly doing sales type stuff, but that's kind of when I was the door opened for me, realizing what I wanted to do initially after school.
Well, if you ever start a second podcast, I think Johnny in the Box is a cool name, and it's a nice throwback for you.
Yeah.
So you move into the recruiting department after the internship with the Chiefs, and then you go on to Fresno State after you graduate from Cal Poly, get a master's in business. But while you're there, you're serving as an NFL liaison for the program. And during that time, I think there was one first-round pick that came from the school, Ryan Matthews, What was it like as an NFL liaison? Were you speaking a lot with the front office folks?
Yeah, I mean, I technically worked for the guy that was quote unquote the NFL liaison, but I was his right hand guy, and it was a bigger school than Cal Poly, but it was similar. We had a small staff, so I kind of got to do everything from watching tape to running recruiting weekends to really working hand in hand with Drew Hill, who hired me. My cousin had played at Fresno State in the mid 2000s, so that was kind of my in to introduce myself, and they had an opening. And then through that, every NFL scout came through our office. I mean, I technically didn't really have an office. I just kind of pulled up a chair. So I really got to meet those guys. And like you said, we had Ryan, who was actually drafted to replace LaDainian Tomlinson, who was, a special college player. But we had a lot of other NFL guys that played in the league for a while, and young guys coming through. I mean, Derek Carr signed my second year. He was a freshman. And we had Coach Hill had a bunch of guys drafted over that time, obviously going back to David Carr, who was the number one pick, to Logan Mankins. So it was an NFL – it was a big stop for NFL scouts, and that was kind of where I love the NFL like most people, but I don't necessarily think I ever dreamed of working in it like as a kid or anything. I'd never even been to an NFL game, to be honest with you, up until I worked in the NFL. And it was just pretty cool meeting those guys. Like, shit, this is what I want to do, or at least try to do. So I got, and luckily I was the best guy to talk to for those guys because I was similar age to the players. I didn't have a filter. I wasn't going to hide anything. Not that we had bad guys or anything. There wasn't much to hide. But I got to know, 3 or 4 guys pretty well. And that was kind of my in to the Philadelphia Eagles.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. So I'm assuming this role with Fresno State is how you landed the Eagles scouting job. So, while you were with the Eagles, after you got your master's or whatnot, you move on there, you're working as a scout with the Eagles. During your time, you guys actually drafted a pretty big core of the 2017 championship team. I saw you had Lane Johnson, Zach Ertz, Nick Foles, Fletcher Cox. What can you give the audience what it's like in the war room on draft day?
Yeah, Kelsey, Brandon Graham. When I got there, Brandon Graham had just been drafted. So yeah, a lot of those guys were definitely there. My first couple years, I worked in the draft room basically every day, but on draft day, especially in the first round, it was a much smaller contingent than I see on television now. So it's just. That whole process leading up is pretty intense because, the first round gets a bunch of hype, but you're spending so much time on all these names, all these guys. So my first year, I was in charge a lot. I mean, in charge would be strong, but I was tasked with picking guys up at the airport, taking them to dinner, taking them around, keeping notes on how they acted and just what they did. So you spend a lot of time, you probably read about those 30 visits, you're allowed 30 visits as a team. And bringing guys in and taking them around to coordinators, head coach, GM, owner, especially owner always met with the high value picks. So yeah, you just kind of do whatever you're told early on. And the draft room, it's draft day is such a big day, but you spend so much time leading up to that day of going to pro days, all-star games, meetings, interviews. It's that day is of the pie chart. It's important because everyone watches it, but in terms of the actual work that goes in, it's really kind of a tiny sliver. But yeah, that day is pretty intense. As the draft goes, by the third day, everyone's going in and out. It's much looser, but that first day is, I would say, pretty tight.
Yeah, I bet
in the building, it's not a lot of by the third day, everyone, you're wearing t-shirts and eating, and GMs and coaches are doing interviews during the draft. So it lightens up a lot as the thing goes on.
Was there ever a player that you scouted, you just fell in love with, but the Eagles passed up on him and he ended up being a really great player?
Yeah, I would say, when I was there, you're not as much you're just kind of giving your reports and the decision makers make them. There's not as much, at least me. I mean, I was in my 20s, like getting up in meetings and banging the table. My last year there, when Chip came in, it was more the opposite. Me kind of saying, because I was doing the West Coast at the time, saying we shouldn't touch this guy. One guy was Matt Barkley, and then obviously Chip loved him and drafted him. So it was honestly more of the negative side than the positive side of you're just giving information. And, there's so many different dynamics. My first couple of years was more on the pro side. So it was more, hey, this guy on this practice squad helps us out. But there are a lot of dynamics of like guys on your team that might be under contract. You don't have a spot. So there's just so many moving pieces. The more and more you're in college, that happens more. But that really happens with every scout, every draft, right? There are going to be guys you like that you don't take. And honestly, there are going to be guys that you're not as high on that your team takes. I mean, it happens probably every pick, past like 15. So It's just that's just the nature of the beast. And guys, it's just part of the job, I guess.
Yeah, and you walked into the Eagles when Andy Reid was there. They were like on the upswing, but then in that 2012 season, Reid departs to Kansas City, where he is now, and Chip Kelly enters the building. And we don't really need to get into too much detail about how all these former players now, like Deshaun Jackson, LaShawn McCoy, are going on record saying, how terrible of a coach and even person he was. I think they even called Jason Peters, the left tackle of the Eagles, to just speak about Kelly, and he went as far as to say that Kelly costed the Eagles 2 Super Bowls. I don't know if I don't know.
That's not necessarily like I doubt the Eagles will win a Super Bowl, but he's just a weird guy, and I think he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because he's just weird. And coming from Andy, who is the easiest going guy in the NFL. And like they kept saying, and like it's well documented, it's not like he's an easy coach. I mean, it's very strict, it's very hard, practical, physical, but he's just a good person. He's easy to deal with. Chip's the opposite. And they're the one thing, and I can't speak. I understand where they're coming from. They kept saying, he treated the race element for the black guys. I think he just treated everyone really weird. I don't think anyone liked him. And, I just think he's very awkward. And, one thing that they said is and this was no different than my interactions, he's just a weird cat. And listen, if you're going to be a weird, like Belichick's, I think people would call him kind of weird, but he's like, you're good at his job. When you're a college guy and then your stuff kind of stops working, and in the pros, your best players you kind of need, right? These guys you can't win in the NFL, especially like Shady McCoy. It's not like a tough guy to deal with. And if you can't figure out a way to deal with him, you got no chance to win. And that ultimately cost him. But I think it's pretty telling. He called like 3 guys, Brandon Graham, who's still on the team, Jeremy Maclin. I mean, Shady's funny. Deshaun can be tough. Some stuff Deshaun's like, yeah, Deshaun. But like when Jeremy Maclin and Jason Peters, who played in the NFL, I think up until like last year, is like 44 years old.
Yeah.
And Brandon Graham's like up for man of the year every year. When those guys are saying that, it's pretty telling. Like you're just like they've gone through a lot of coaches. And one thing's clear, like they like Doug, they like Sirianni, they like Andy. They all hate this guy. And people think I'm biased or whatever. I only dealt with him for 4 years, but my buddies on the staff dealt with him for years. And no one has a good word to say about the guy.
Wow. And that's crazy because now, he's at Ohio State. We'll see how he does.
And look what he just did. He just picked up and left from UCLA to go become an offensive coordinator. Yeah. He's just a weirred cat, man. And listen, at one point in time, his stuff was revolutionary and Oregon was awesome, but it's 2024. I mean, that's the bloom's off the rose a little bit.
So if you can go back to the summer of 2010 when you first landed that Eagles job and you could give yourself a piece of advice, what would it be?
I would say keep better notes. Like it's when you get to the NFL, and not all teams are the same, but the Eagles specifically, and we're Howie's intense. It's just an intense environment. And it's easy to get overwhelmed because there's a lot going on. And no matter how many things you're told to do, there's always stuff coming in that you have to do. So the more just kind of detailed you can be with what you need to do and keeping track of everything. It was hard. I mean, my first couple months there were, you see some of these like movies on how like Wall Street, for young guys, long hours, the intensity. It's what it kind of felt like. And once you kind of get your feet under you, you kind of understand the ebb and flow of days. And once the season starts, it's very consistent. Every Monday's the same, Tuesday's the same, Wednesday's the same. But it's just there's a lot going on, a lot of people pulling at you. And I would just say the more detailed is the wrong way to put it. I would say the more structured you can kind of keep your tasks, it's easy to not get overwhelmed, because it's not an easy place to work, which I think has suited me well moving forward, because I saw that intensity, and everything else I've done since has been a lot easier.
Yeah. And after that point, John, you go on to co-host, I think, the Bay Area Game Day and 95.7 The Game. And you work as a writer for The Athletic. So you're starting your career in the media after your Eagle Scouting stint. And you even started a podcast with called Haberman and Middlekauff. So what made you want to transition to the media after football and not seek out like another scouting role?
Yeah, I would say once I got let go when Chip came in after the draft, I didn't want to move around. And I don't know. I had made my way back to the West Coast, and it kind of, in a weird way, organically happened, though I was trying to get in with different people. And then I think, like anything, you find out you're kind of good at something, you just kind of stick with it. So I didn't have some grand plan, 10 years later to be sitting here doing something with Coward, but you try different things under the umbrella of what you're good at. And obviously in this business, there's a lot of different things you can do. And then, in your 20s and even early 30s, you just kind of hone in on what you're talented at, what you think big picture you can have the most success at financially, professionally, and you just kind of figure it out as you go. And that's kind of been my story. There hasn't been some grand plan. It just kind of a mixture of, organically, naturally happening, and, doubling down as things started working. And then you just start, see a different lifestyle of a different industry of what you're used to. Like, I scratch my itch in the NFL is cool. I've always said this, I don't like football enough to do it. And I obviously like football a lot, but you have to be basically an addict to be really good at that job and making that in that industry. And I like this job more. I'm better at it, and I control my own destiny this way. And I enjoy waking up every day doing what I'm doing, and I get excited. So I don't really know how else to put it.
Yeah, that's awesome that you found that area, that space to stay close to football, maybe not grinding in it 24/7, but still you're getting the exposure, being able to talk about it. One of the biggest things that I do is I go back and look at podcasters such as yourself and see what you were like back in like 2018 when you were first like coming out and your like first episodes or whatever, and compare it to where you are now and just seeing like differences in your game. If you can go like just think about one of the things that you've learned over like 10 years in media, like what's like, I guess, one of the biggest lessons you've learned when preparing for the podcast and all that?
That's a good question. I would say I don't know if I do anything much different than I did 7-8 years ago, to be honest with you. I just think the more you do anything, the better you get at it. That 10,000 hour rule. I don't approach it that much differently. Like, I've never been someone that gets too into the weeds and is breaking down play after play. Like, I enjoy, I was a sports talk radio listener my entire life. So, I got a pretty good idea what works, what doesn't. Not saying that I'm right all the time, but, content and talking about the right things has never been a huge issue. I would just say, obviously, this day and age, in the radio days, you talk baseball and basketball. I just talk football now, 24/7, 365. And I do some golf too. That's more of like a passion project and something I like. But I mean, football pays the bills around here, so there's no way around to just focus on what matters, in the NFL, and if anything big happens in college football. But I would say I've just gotten better at it. But in terms of my approach and the way I put together a podcast or the topics, I don't think much has changed, to be honest with you.
All right, let's move on to NFL for like the last 5 minutes. So like in the draft, there were a bunch of headlines. I think the biggest one was when the Falcons shocked the world, took Michael Penix. What would you have done differently if you were Atlanta's GM there? Would you have went for like the best defensive player? Because a lot of people were confused by that pick.
Yeah, I just think that if you're going to invest that much into a starting quarterback, I just wouldn't have drafted a quarterback at 8. And if I was thinking about drafting a quarterback at 8, I wouldn't have paid Kirk Cousins all that money and invested that money in, let's say, Christian Wilkins, the defensive lineman from the Dolphins. So I just think you had different options of building your team that I just don't quite – because when you take a quarterback, ultimately when they took Jordan Love, for example, he was a big project. Right. And no one ever thought he was better than Aaron Rodgers when Aaron Rodgers was on the team, because he wasn't. The team knew it. The fans knew it. My mom knew it. Everyone knew it. This one can get weird fast because Cousins, it's not like he's walking in there with 2 MVPs and 3 Super Bowl appearances. He's won 1 playoff game. He was really good these last couple years, but one knock on him has always been, a little bit underperformer under the bright lights and, pressure and all that stuff. Something like Jared Goff, for example, is kind of shook because it's like he's played well in playoff games. It's pretty clear. And it's why the Lions feel pretty good about giving him all that money. Where Cousins, there are some question marks, and then he's coming off a major injury. You use the 8th pick. Well, quarterback is the one position beside kicker and punter that if you have 2 of them, one guy's useless. Like if you take a defensive lineman and you have 4 Reggie Whites on your team, that defensive lineman can still play. He can still play 20 snaps a game, when he's rotating in. At quarterback, this guy doesn't do anything, right? It's why Jordan Love, the pushback with Aaron Rodgers was, hey, we're a 13-win team. We're right there. I'm fucking Aaron Rodgers. Like we can win the Super Bowl. Like this, we need to utilize this pick. We could have traded up and got Brandon Ayuk or something to go with Devontae. Like it was a legitimate argument. This is, you still have a lot of needs in your defense is not good, especially your defensive line. So there are defensive linemen. Now they would argue we didn't feel comfortable taking a defensive lineman at 8. I get it, but I just think part of being a GM and part of running a team is planning. And it feels like their planning is kind of all – this feels like the coach is heavily, heavily involved, which he should be. But when you let him make decisions, like did the owner just want Cousins and they want a rookie quarterback? I don't know. It just feels really off, and it's going to be fascinating to watch because I don't think they are some lock to just be a playoff team and win the division. That's for sure.
Yeah, they're definitely not moving in cohesion, front office, owner, and coaching. You can definitely see that there. But if just looking at this class, I mean, I think 6 QBs went in the top 12.
12, yeah.
If you had to pick one to be elite, and I know that's a very high standard, so I'm talking like Burrow, Mahomes, Allen. Like if someone's going to go into that stratosphere, which QB would it be?
Well, Caleb's the best player of the group. So he's going to a team that has a lot of talent around him. He had an opportunity. But in the NFL, it's about more than your talent. It's about who's coaching you. They have a defensive coach that if they were not to make the playoffs would get fired. So immediately it'd be off to a weird start. Like there's a lot of pressure on the Bears. Not necessarily on Caleb, though there's the hype behind him strong. There's pressure on the coach to win. So anytime that takes place, it's weird. I went back and watched a little of Bo Nix, and I just think, what Sean Payton's going to ask him to do. Physically, he's not as talented as those guys, but I could just see him being a really, really good player, over the next 5 years because his coach is the offensive coordinator. They have some offensive weapons. Drake May is a major project, and that team sucks. Jaden Daniels is a very talented player, but he's a one-year wonder. His offensive coordinator is Cliff Kingsbury, that everyone acts like Bill Walsh. I mean, let's face it, I don't know. His offense has been great in the NFL by any means. Who else? J.J. McCarthy's not even going to play for a while, and he's a little bit of a project as well. Same thing with Penix. Like, if Cousins is just solid and they're winning, like, he's not going to play either. Now, if you told me Penix, Cousins just did not exist and Penix was the starter, I would be very, very intrigued these next couple of years. But
Yeah.
It's hard to tell, like, when does he ever get to play? Obviously, Caleb would be one, and Penix would be my wild card. Now, I could see Bo Nix just being pretty solid immediately because Russell Wilson's not that good anymore, and he put up really good numbers last year for the Broncos.
Yeah, and Bo Nix just seems like he fits that Broncos system. So we'll see what he
get
does there.
Get rid of the ball fast. They can roll him. Drew wasn't a great athlete by the end as he got older. Bo's a much better athlete, so they're going to be able to definitely do some more stuff on offense. And the other thing is, it's pretty powerful when the coach likes you. Right?
Yeah.
The coach is heavily invested in Bo, so it's I'm really kind of fired up to watch kind of that take place.
Yeah, that should be interesting. Now, final question. I wanted to ask you, if you had to pick one player in this draft, and in 5 years, if they become an all-pro, I'll give you $1 million. So you're basically telling me which player are you the most confident about, regardless of position? Who would that be for you?
That's a good question. I think you would have to, if Jim Harbaugh loves you as an offensive lineman, and you have the talent he has in Joe Alt. My question was, is he a little tall, but texting around, everyone thinks he bends well. I'd be shocked if he's not really good. I'd be, because when Harbaugh got to the 49ers and they had some young offensive linemen, all of them became Pro Bowlers, basically. Staley already kind of was, but Anthony Davis, Mike Upati, he's probably going to be really, really good.
Yeah.
And it's not the sexiest position because wide receivers, you never know, right?
Yeah.
Neighbors is a stud, but who's his quarterback? Rome Odunze, how many balls is he going to get thrown at him? Harrison, that situation, he's the number one guy. They start getting double teamed, but you just start at right or left tackle with a big time offensive coach who's going to run the ball a lot. I could see Joe Alt just being a really good player.
Yep. Well, John, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Guys, go check out his podcast, 3 and Out. It's everywhere. Just Google his name, @John Middlekauff on Twitter. Go follow him.